The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Victor had always been a monster, not in the sense of mindless brutality, but in the ruthless, calculated way he moved through the world. A predator who understood that fear and control were as effective as any weapon, and that when it came to his family he would scorch the earth before he let anyone take what was his. That was the energy that carried him into the narrow, forgotten alley that night, the city's neon bleeding weakly onto wet pavement. The distant hum of traffic muffled by the oppressive quiet that wrapped around him like a shroud. He had followed Matt with the patience born from years of corporate warfare and personal vendettas, watching every misstep, learning every pattern, narrowing every escape route until there was nowhere left for him to go. The air smelled of oil, rain, and garbage, an incongruous backdrop to the high-stakes drama unfolding as Victor stepped out of the shadows, his tall frame cutting through the darkness. The barrel of his gun leveled with unwavering precision at Matt's chest. He did not tremble, did not hesitate. This was who he was when his family was threatened, a relentless force that did not negotiate with kidnappers or opportunists. Sienna's terrified silence, somewhere behind Matt, bound to this madness by her connection to the Newman world, had only sharpened his resolve. In Victor's mind, the equation had been simple. Matt had taken what belonged to him, and so Matt would pay, one way or another. Yet the moment that should have belonged entirely to Victor's dominance shattered in an instant when Matt, cornered and desperate, but not broken, threw out a truth so wild it sliced straight through the veneer of Victor's control. Instead of pleading for his life or bargaining for leverage, Matt shouted words that seemed to warp the very air around them. A claim hurled not as a last-minute bluff, but as a confession torn from the depths of some long-buried history. He declared himself Victor's biological son, a blood tie hidden in the shadows, a branch of the Newman tree that had never been acknowledged, never nurtured, never even known. For a heartbeat, Victor could not process it. The world narrowed to the echo of that revelation bouncing between the brick walls, louder than any gunshot. His hand, which had been steady as stone, faltered, the barrel dipping just slightly as his mind recoiled from the impact. Victor prided himself on being unshakable, on having anticipated every angle of the game he played with his enemies. But this impossible claim was not one he had accounted for. The monster in him knew how to deal with threats, but the father in him, the man who had built his legacy around blood and legacy and the undeniable power of the Newman name, suddenly found himself staring at something he could not simply shoot into silence. In that suspended moment, the alley transformed from a battlefield into a mirror, forcing Victor to look at the fractures in his own past. Matt's face, usually a mask of defiance and cunning, now carried something raw, something almost haunted, as he rushed to explain what had been hidden from them both. He spoke of a woman who had once been close enough to Victor to carry his child, but distant enough from the Newman orbit to slip away, choosing secrecy over the chaos she knew would follow if Victor ever learned the truth. She had, according to Matt, spent years living with the weight of that choice, raising her son outside the reach of the man whose name could have opened doors but whose influence could just as easily have destroyed him. To protect him from the brutal games of power, wealth, and control that defined the Newman world, she had concealed his existence entirely, letting him grow up watching the empire from afar rather than from within its walls. For Matt, the revelation of his supposed bloodline had come not as a gift but as a curse. Knowing he was the son of Victor Newman had not made him feel chosen. It had made him feel abandoned, discarded, denied. And in that festering resentment, his life had taken the twisted paths that eventually led him here, in this alley, holding Sienna as leverage against a father who had never even known to claim him. As Victor listened, a storm of doubt and anger and reluctant curiosity roared through him. He prided himself on knowing every chapter of his history, on keeping tight control over his narrative. Yet now he was forced to confront the possibility that there had been an entire life playing out in the margins of his story, a life linked to him not by choice or contract, but by blood. His mind involuntarily flickered through memories of affairs, moments of weakness, decisions he had justified as necessary or insignificant. He had children he acknowledged, children he had fought for, children he had hurt and protected and shaped with his iron will. His identity as a father was as much a part of his myth as his triumphs in the boardroom. The Newman legacy was something he wielded like a sword, a justification for every brutal decision he made in the name of protecting his own. To consider that there might be another child out there, one he had never known, one who had grown into a man filled with enough rage to target his family, shook the foundation of that identity. What did it say about him if it were true? What did it mean for the stories he told himself about loyalty, protection, and control? The pride he felt in the Newman bloodline, in the empire he had built and the children who were supposed to carry it forward, suddenly seemed less solid, less pure. What if there had been a fracture from the beginning, a hidden flaw in the foundation that no one had ever addressed because no one had known to look for it? Matt's confession was not just about paternity. It was a direct attack on Victor's belief that he had always been the one in control, the architect of his family's destiny. Now he had to face the idea that someone else, some woman from his past, some hidden chapter of his life had made a decision that fundamentally reshaped his family's story without his knowledge or consent. It was a violation of everything he depended on: information, power, clarity. For the first time in a very long time, Victor found himself on the back foot, emotionally if not strategically, and he hated it. Still, even as his mind reeled, the core of who he was, protector, strategist, monster, did not disappear. His eyes shifted past Matt for a brief moment, catching sight of Sienna in the dim light, bound by fear as much as by whatever physical restraints Matt had imposed. The instinct to save her, to remove her from this nightmare, surged through him as forcefully as the questions eclipsing his thoughts. Blood or no blood, Matt had crossed a line by dragging an innocent woman into his vendetta. Victor could not forgive that easily, no matter what truth lay between them. He barked out an order, his voice low and edged with steel, demanding that Matt release Sienna. The command came from the same part of him that had driven him into the alley with a gun in his hand, the kneeling protector who would not tolerate his people being used as pawns. But his hand no longer held the same certainty it had minutes before. The gun felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of the implications of what it meant to pull the trigger. In Matt's eyes, Victor saw something disturbingly familiar, a reflection of his own rage, his own capacity for obsession, his own refusal to back down even when cornered. If Matt was lying, it was an extraordinarily calculated lie, one tailored to exploit the single vulnerability Victor would never admit to: his family. If he was telling the truth, then Victor was standing in a dark alley pointing a gun at his own flesh and blood, ready to end a life that might be an extension of his own. The thought made his stomach tighten, a rare and unwelcome sensation. The monster in him wanted to dismiss the revelation, to treat it as a desperate ploy and far anyway, reclaiming control through the simplicity of violence. But the father in him, the man who had stared into the faces of his children and sworn in his own way to protect them, could not quite force that part of himself into silence. The barrel of the gun drifted, just slightly, as if guided by the weight of his uncertainty. He ordered Matt again to let Sienna go, but this time the command carried something new under its surface: a crack in the armor, a hesitation he could not fully hide from himself. It infuriated him to feel that hesitation, to feel his judgment clouded by the possibility of blood ties. This was the very thing he prided himself on avoiding: sentimentality interfering with necessity. Yet here he was, held hostage by a confession he could not immediately disprove. His mind raced through options. He could wound rather than kill, incapacitate Matt without ending him, buy time to investigate the truth of his claim. He could leverage this new information, use it to turn Matt from an enemy into a weapon under his control, if he could endure the insult of bending rather than breaking. He could also choose to ignore it entirely and do what he had come here to do: eliminate the threat and deal with the fallout later. But for once, the cold calculus refused to settle into a clear decision. Every path carried consequences that felt heavier than usual. As if the universe itself were watching to see which version of Victor Newman would emerge from this alley, The ruthless patriarch who would sacrifice anyone, even his own blood, to protect the rest. Or the man who allowed the possibility of redemption, connection, and truth to stay his hand. Matt, sensing the shift, did not relax. If anything, the tension between them intensified. He had not expected his confession to magically save him, but he had counted on one thing: that Victor's obsession with his family would at least slow him down. And it had. He could see the fracture in Victor's legendary composure, the way doubt had crept into his eyes despite the still dangerous posture he held. Yet Matt was not foolish enough to believe that meant he was safe. Monsters did not simply stop being monsters because someone uttered the word family. If anything, the stakes had increased. By claiming his blood, Matt had tethered himself to Victor in a way that could either spare him or condemn him more completely. If Victor chose not to kill him because of their shared blood, that meant he might instead decide to control him, reshape him, bend him into something useful or obedient, which in Matt's mind might be worse than death. If Victor chose to ignore his claim and pull the trigger anyway, it would confirm what Matt had always suspected, that the Newman patriarch loved the idea of family more than the actual people who comprised it. The alley held its breath as these thoughts collided silently in the space between them. Sienna's presence was a constant reminder that they were not dealing in hypotheticals, but in lives real, fragile lives being strangled by decades of secrets, pride, and vengeance. Victor's intelligence, the same ruthless brilliance that had allowed him to corner Matt here, began working furiously behind his hardened gaze. He realized that whether or not Matt was truly his son, this moment could not be wasted. Information was power, and right now he had stumbled onto a truth, or at least a claim that could redefine the game. If Matt was telling the truth, then Victor had been robbed of years with a child who had grown into a man shaped by resentment instead of guidance. If Matt was lying, then he had revealed exactly how far he was willing to go, how deeply he had studied Victor's psyche, and that alone was valuable intelligence. Either way, Victor could not let his emotions drive the final move, no matter how deeply they cut. Still, the conflict inside him did not vanish. It simmered, thick and consuming, as he grappled with a choice that could not be delayed forever. The monster in him whispered that the cleanest solution was to end this now, to remove Matt from the equation and reclaim Sienna without further complication. The father in him whispered that some truths, once buried, could not be ignored without staining everything that came after. And caught between those two voices, Victor Newman, so often the master of every board he stepped onto, found himself in the rare and unsettling position of not knowing which version of himself he could live with when the smoke finally cleared. For the first time in a long time, pulling the trigger did not feel like the inevitable conclusion, but neither did mercy. As the gun remained fixed but unfired and Sienna's fate still hung in the balance, the darkest question settled over the alley like fog in a man who had always defined himself by the lengths he would go to protect his family. What happened when the threat and the blood tie were one and the same, and the line between enemy and son blurred beyond recognition? The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Genoa City smelled of rust and damp concrete, a fitting stage for the end of a nightmare. Victor Newman stood in the center of the dimly lit space, his silhouette cutting a sharp, imposing figure against the gray light filtering through the grime-streaked windows. In his hand, a sleek black pistol was leveled steadily at the chest of the man kneeling before him. Matt Clark, known to some as Mitch Bacca, looked up, sweat streaking through the grime on his face. His arrogance, usually worn like a second skin, had dissolved into something raw and primal. Fear. "You thought you could threaten my family," Victor's voice was a low rumble, devoid of mercy. "You thought you could kidnap Sienna, terrorize my grandson, and walk away unscathed. You are a fool, Matt." "Victor, wait," Matt gasped, his hands raised in surrender, trembling slightly. "I am done waiting." Victor stepped closer, the leather of his shoes crunching on the debris-littered floor. "You have crossed every line. You have made yourself a pestilence that I must eradicate. For Noah, for my family." Victor's finger tightened on the trigger. The air in the warehouse grew heavy, the silence stretching until it was almost deafening. He had protected his legacy with ruthlessness for decades. Eliminating a threat like Matt was simply necessary maintenance. "I'm your son." The words cracked through the tension like a whip. Victor froze. The gun didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed, the icy blue gaze locking onto Matt's frantic face. "What did you say?" "I'm your son," Matt repeated, his voice breathless, desperate. "Not just some random enemy, Victor. I am your blood. That's why I came back. That's why I hate you and why I wanted to be you." Victor's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering near his temple. "You are lying." A desperate lie from a dying man. "Check the timeline," Matt shouted, leaning forward despite the weapon pointed at his heart. 30 years ago. The woman you met in Chicago. Julia? No, not Julia. It was before her. You remember the name Elena. You walked away, left her with nothing but a check and a promise you never kept. She was pregnant, Victor. She kept me. She raised me to know exactly who my father was. The name Elena struck Victor with the force of a physical blow. A memory long buried under mountains of corporate takeovers and family crises flickered in the dark recesses of his mind. A brief affair. A woman whose face had blurred with time. Victor's grip on the gun loosened, the barrel lowering just an inch. The lethal intent in his eyes was replaced by a storm of confusion and sudden, paralyzing doubt. If this was true. If this man, this monster who had tormented Noah, was his own flesh and blood. "Get up," Victor commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet commanding absolute obedience. Matt scrambled to his feet, wary, eyeing the gun that was no longer pointed directly at his heart, but was still very much in play. "You will not move," Victor hissed. He pulled a burner phone from his coat pocket, his eyes never leaving Matt. He dialed a number, his movements sharp and precise. "It's me. The extraction team is at the south entrance. Secure the package. I want him taken to the safe house. The secure one. No one knows he is there. Do you understand?" As the heavy metal doors of the warehouse groaned open, Victor's security team swarmed in, efficient and silent. They seized Matt, zip-tying his wrists and hooding him before dragging him toward the waiting SUV. Matt didn't fight. He knew he had played his ace, and for now, it had bought him his life. Victor watched the vehicle speed away, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He holstered the gun, the cold steel burning against his side. Meanwhile, across town, the chaos was subsiding into relief. Nick Newman kicked open the door to the motel room, his weapon drawn, with the JCPD tactical team right behind him. "Clear right. Clear left." "Noah," a voice cried out from the corner. Sienna was bound to a chair, gagged, her eyes wide with terror that instantly melted into tears as she saw Nick. Noah rushed past his father, dropping to his knees beside her. "I've got you," Noah choked out, his hands shaking as he worked the knots of the ropes binding her wrists. "You're safe, Sienna. It's over," he said. "He said he was going to kill you," Sienna sobbed, collapsing into Noah's arms as the ropes fell away. "He said Victor would never find us." Nick holstered his weapon, watching his son hold the woman he loved. He pulled out his phone, sending a text to the family group chat. Sienna secured. Safe. Coming home. But as he looked at the text, a gnawing unease settled in his gut. Where was Victor? His father had insisted on handling Matt alone, a move that Nick had argued against vehemently. Victor had gone dark an hour ago. Later that evening, the mood at the Newman Ranch was a dissonant mix of celebration and suffocating tension. Sienna was being attended to by the family doctor in one of the guest suites, Noah refusing to leave her side. Downstairs, Nikki paced the living room, a glass of sherry untouched in her hand. The front door opened, and Victor entered. He looked composed, his suit impeccable, but Nikki knew him better than anyone. She saw the shadow in his eyes, the slight stoop in his shoulders that hadn't been there that morning. "Victor," Nikki set her glass down. Nick called. "Sienna is safe. But where is Matt? Did the police take him into custody?" Victor walked to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a tequila with a heavy hand. He didn't turn to face her immediately. Matt is handled. Handled, Nikki's voice sharpened. What does that mean, Victor? Is he dead? He is in a secure location, Victor said, turning around. His face was a mask of stone. Alive. Why? Nikki stepped closer, searching his face. After everything he did to Noah, to our family, you had the chance to end this threat legally, to hand him over to Paul or the authorities. There are complications, Victor said, his voice dropping. He took a sip of the drink, the burn doing little to settle the turmoil in his stomach. Matters that require verification. What kind of verification? Victor looked at his wife, the weight of the secret pressing down on him. He couldn't tell her yet. Not until he knew. The possibility that he had fathered a psychopath at the very enemy attacking his grandchild was his own son was a poison he had to swallow alone for now. I need you to trust me, Nikki, he said, stepping past her toward his study. I have to make a call. Inside the sanctuary of his office, Victor locked the door. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the portrait of himself staring down from the wall, a reminder of the dynasty he had built, the bloodline he fought so fiercely to protect. He picked up the phone and dialed the private line of the Newman Enterprises medical director. This is Victor Newman, he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. I need a team at the outcome location immediately. You will take a sample from the prisoner. I want a full DNA profile run against my own. Expedite it. I want the results within 12 hours. He paused, listening to the stammering compliance on the other end. And listen to me closely, Victor growled, leaning forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. If a single word of this leaks to the press, to my family, to any of you will never work in this industry again. Do you understand? He slammed the phone down. Victor leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes. The image of Matt's face in the warehouse of fear, the resemblance around the eyes that Victor hadn't wanted to see flashed in his mind. Elena. If Matt was his son, everything changed. The justice he sought for Noah would become a fratricidal nightmare. The monster was no longer just a villain. He was a Newman. In the silence of the study, Victor Newman waited, the master of the universe suddenly terrified of a simple sheet of paper that could rewrite his past and destroy his future.